Hi, welcome to 5.08, The Government is a Police Officer 1, and this is starting with slide 1. Even people living in free market economies are not completely free to make economic choices. When the government forces consumers to give up some money in the form of taxes, it limits budgetary choices. When the government prohibits the purchase of certain items, restricts advertising, and requires specific information on package labels, this all limits free choice. The government limits economic choices in many ways, from reducing or increasing wages, to preventing or enabling certain economic activities, to limiting or producing what can be seen in the media. These limitations have many effects on people's lives and on the economy as a whole. You have learned that the government protects the free market by limiting certain economic choices to guarantee that competition remains open and that consumers are protected. But once the government begins limiting choices, it can become difficult to keep it from restricting certain things. Often, government restrictions and regulations are designed to increase economic freedom, as with antitrust and consumer protection laws. But while citizens want the government to make sure that all the free market systems operates freely, they might have other goals they want the government to help them achieve as well. Remember that freedom isn't the only economic goal that people pursue. Other goals include efficiency, growth, security, and equity. Citizens might expect their government to promote one or more of these other goals, which almost always involves restricting choices. In this lesson, you'll examine other types of restrictions that the government imposes as it pursues other goals. Land use. One major way that the government restricts economic choice is through the regulation of property. In free market economies, individuals have property rights that enable them to own land, but the law often limits their property rights. A land use law is any regulation that sets a limit on what owners can do with their property. One major type of land use law is a zoning ordinance. Local governments use zoning ordinances to control and guide development in the community by restricting where residences and businesses may be built. Zoning ordinances divide towns or cities into districts, and each district has a designated type of use that determines the kinds of buildings that can be constructed on the property and limits how those buildings can be used. Common designations are residential, commercial, industrial, and mixed-use zones. If your neighborhood is zoned residential, you should not have to worry about a factory or a skyscraper being built next door. But you will probably not be allowed to turn your house into a store or a workshop. Zoning ordinances are used to promote orderly development and to preserve a certain kind of landscape. For example, zoning can protect the quiet and privacy of a residential area or keep an urban area from turning into an industrial eyesore. These ordinances put specific limits on what people may do with their own property, so they are a type of choice restriction faced by citizens every day. Up to code. Land use laws restrict property owners in other ways. When a construction company erects a building, it must comply with building codes that establish minimum structural and technical requirements for that specific type of building. These codes apply to all aspects of construction: foundations, roofing, plumbing, electrical wiring, building height, proximity to other structures, and so on. It does not matter if someone wants to build a massive warehouse or simply an added room. Permits are needed for construction projects of all sizes. If permit procedures and building codes are not followed, construction can be shut down and hefty penalties applied. Sometimes the structure might even be demolished. Eminent domain. Rather than regulating the use of a particular property, sometimes the government will actually take ownership of the property through the power of eminent domain. Eminent domain allows a government to force a private owner to sell his or her property to the government to make way for a public project. Here is an example. A family-owned farm may be in an area where the government plans to build an airport. To clear the way, the private owners of the farm will be required to surrender ownership rights, whether they want to or not. In return, the government provides compensation at fair market value. Using the power of eminent domain represents a major intrusion into an individual's property rights, so it is generally used only for very important public projects that are expected to benefit a large number of people. Often, the construction of highways, airports, and military facilities can be accomplished only by using the power of eminent domain. Land use laws review. Land use laws limit property rights. Match the regulations with examples of their use to review your understanding of these restrictions on property owners. Labor laws. Another area where the government may restrict choice is in the relations between workers and employers. These restrictions are known collectively as labor law. Specific labor laws cover issues such as wages, working hours, working conditions, hiring, and just about anything else related to employment. In the United States, federal and state labor laws apply to workers and employers. Modern labor laws first came into being with the Industrial Revolution as a means to protect manual laborers in factories and mines. Over time, the growing strength of labor unions, along with citizen concerns about workplace safety, led to the expansion of labor laws to encompass employment in all settings. One fundamental restriction that governments place on employment is the minimum wage, which is the lowest hourly rate a worker can earn, with very few exceptions. Federal law requires payment of no less than $7.25 per hour as of 2013, and a rate of 1.5 times the usual rate for any hours worked in excess of 40 hours a week. Some states have even higher minimum wage levels. Many labor laws regulate working conditions to minimize the risk of workplace accidents. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, creates and enforces safety regulations in the workplace, and it actively inspects workplaces in the U.S. to ensure compliance. Since its creation in 1971, OSHA has helped reduce workplace fatalities by more than 60%. Labor law also applies to unions. The National Labor Relations Act, originally passed in 1935, sets forth procedures for union organization and collective bargaining. This act states, for example, that employers may not fire employees for being involved in union activities. Price controls. Another way in which governments restrict economic choice is through price controls. Examples of price controls include the price ceiling, which prevents prices from exceeding a certain maximum, and the price floor, which prohibits prices from dropping below a certain minimum. Governments have enacted price controls since ancient times. The oldest price controls included prohibitions on exorbitant interest for loans and limits on the price of bread. More recent examples of price controls include fixed prices for gasoline and some agricultural goods. Sometimes it becomes necessary for governments to control the general level of prices because of wars or other national emergencies. In the United States, for example, across-the-board price controls were imposed during World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. In the early 1970s, in response to out-of-control inflation, the government instituted a series of temporary price controls. Price controls are usually meant to protect certain vulnerable groups. For example, price ceilings on bread protect poor people who rely on bread as a dietary staple. Price floors on commodities such as corn and soybeans help protect farmers from being driven out of business. When governments control prices, they stabilize costs for the benefit of certain groups of consumers or producers, but everyone's economic choices are restricted to achieve that benefit. Price controls, effects, and responses. Price controls can protect vulnerable groups, but they have a major effect on an economy in which the law of supply and demand is supposed to determine prices. When a price ceiling is set for a particular product, that price is lower than the equilibrium price of the free market. Demand for that product increases and supply decreases. So, price ceilings cause shortages. Price floors, on the other hand, cause surpluses. Why does this happen? Remember, demand increases as price decreases. More consumers are willing to buy a product as its price drops. At the same time, demand decreases when price increases. Remember also that the supply decreases along with prices because fewer products Fewer producers want to supply a product at very low prices. Supply increases when price increases. When price controls artificially raise or lower prices, supply and demand have pushed in different directions. Rationing. Price controls affect the normal function of the law of supply and demand in a free market economy. To reduce some of the negative effects of price controls when such measures are needed, the government may resort to rationing. Rationing restricts the purchase of certain goods to predetermined quantities. Regardless of consumer demand or ability to pay for a good, the consumer can purchase only a specified amount of that good. While the need for rationing can occur during a period of price ceilings, it more often occurs in times of emergency. After a natural disaster, the government may ration goods that are in short supply or needed in specific areas. During wartime, the government may ration public purchase of goods that are needed by the military. Rationing requires the governments to adjust rations to match fluctuating supply. Like decisions made in a command economy, it is usually more difficult for government planners to foresee changing resources and needs than it is for the market to adjust naturally. Also, in times of rationing, some people will choose to buy and sell rationed goods illegally in what is sometimes called a black market. Trade restrictions. International trade is another area where government restrictions affect the operation of the free market. You have seen before that governments use protectionist policies such as tariffs and subsidies to protect domestic producers against foreign competition. The government can also use a quota to limit the import of a foreign-made good. Like tariffs and subsidies, quotas limit imports and they benefit domestic producers. Quotas reduce the supply of goods, causing prices to rise and allowing domestic producers to expand production. The government may also employ a trade embargo against one or more foreign countries. An embargo limits or entirely prohibits trade with a particular country. Embargoes can be a response to protectionist policies by a trading partner. For example, an embargo on trade could be a response to a particularly high tariff. Embargoes also have political purposes. The U.S. government imposed a trade embargo against Cuba in 1962, when relations with Cuba's communist government worsened. The U.S. government also prohibits American citizens from doing business with Iran, as a result of long-standing disagreements on a number of political issues. Trade restrictions limit economic choice worldwide, not just domestically. In limiting world trade, trade restriction reduce choice within the global economy. Banking regulations. Banking is one of the most highly regulated industries in the world. Governments monitor and control banking to protect consumers and to ensure sound banking practices that are necessary for financial stability. Banks are required to take steps to ensure safe and secure transactions, and to detect and prevent money laundering and other financial crimes. A government may freeze assets of suspected criminals to prevent them from using their money in illegal ways. The government also often uses capital controls to limit the flow of investment money into and out of the country. Capital controls prevent speculators from rushing into a country's market, taking large profits, and leaving behind a disrupted economy. Central banks, which are government-controlled institutions, also enact banking controls. These include the required reserve, which both protects customers and allows the government to control the money supply. The reserve also allows every bank to satisfy the normal daily withdrawal requests by customers and acts as a cushion in case of a bank run. The reserve requirement can also be used to raise or lower the money supply by adjusting the amount of money that banks can loan. We are going to end this recording here on slide 29. It will later pick up on, this is slide 14. It will later pick up on slide 15. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns about this information. Have a great day.